States will not be intervening directly because Ukraine is not a NATO ally.
Right.
Also, have you seen the reports of that massive 40-plus mile long convoy coming out of Belarus? It would take more than one. But that's kind of a good example of how the Russians suck at logistics. So if it came to a direct head-to-head fight between the United States and the Russians, our military is brilliant at logistics. It's like it's Disneyland, the military, everybody else.
Right.
And the only thing they're better at is taking out a large number of vehicles that are in a line.
Yeah.
So if it did come to a regular war between Russia and the United States, we would wipe the floor with them in terms of the armored warfare and the artillery battle. And then they would feel that they would have no choice but to consider nukes. And so there's no reason to expect the United States to directly intervene.
Right.
We will play favorites. We are playing favorites. Congress is going to be asked tonight to send at least $6 billion in direct military equipment to the Ukrainians. I figured that'll pass in a matter of seconds. We have sent a whole lot of javelins. We don't know how many, probably at least 1,000 launchers by this point, and every country in NATO is sending everything they have. One of the fun things about NATO is that during the Cold War, there were different tiers of military equipment because some countries were more advanced. When the Cold War ended, everyone spent 15 years upgrading their equipment, and they handed the older stuff to the new allies in Central Europe and Turkey. Now, all of those countries have upgraded their equipment, and they're sending all their hand-me-downs to Ukraine. So there's a metric butt ton of stuff that's going into Ukraine right now. And that is not going to turn the tide of the war, but it means that the Russians will have to pay in blood for every single inch. And once they capture it, they'll be partisans and they'll have to go back and do it again. And the only way the Russians know how to deal with that is to level everything. And this is just the next phase in what the Russia sees as multi-step expansion. They're not done with Ukraine. Well, the soldiers are most of the soldiers are draftees. So you can imagine how they feel about what's going on right now, since they didn't realize that this is what they were going to be in for. For the Russians back in Russia, no. There have been a number of protest movements in Russia over the last several years, and they've got progressively smaller. And when I looked yesterday at the numbers, there were only about 6,000 Russians total that have been arrested so far nationwide. That's nowhere near enough to generate the sort of activity that Putin's going to be even the least bit concerned about. The report I heard this morning from Ukraine, which made me perk up a little bit, is that apparently a couple platoons of Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainians, and not after a fight. If you get mass desertions among the Russian soldiers, then we're talking about a very different situation. But this is one report that has not been confirmed. But if you're going to be looking for hope on the Russian side, it'll be in Ukraine, not in Russia. I think that's a little simplistic. If the United States were to get involved in Ukraine in a real way, that would be the Air Force, that would be the Special Forces, that would be the Army. If we're going to get involved in Ukraine, it's going to be the Navy. It's an island. It's just basic military math. I also don't think that the Chinese are itching to go, because if the Chinese did, the war would look very different from Ukraine. So in Ukraine, Russia holds all the mid and long-term advantages here. More equipment, more men, a self-sustaining system at home. China is 100% dependent upon international trade as maintained by the American-led globalized order. And if they try to throw a wrench in that, they lose access, because we'll just put a couple of destroyers out in the Indian Ocean and cut the energy line. 3 months later, the buses stop running because they run out of fuel. 3 months after that, the power goes out. And less than a year after that, they lose 500 million people to famine, because agriculture is an internationalized trade-based system, and all the inputs that allow them to grow their food are not from China.
Toxic the way it's gone through the pandemic.
I'm not going to comment on the Fed, because the Fed is about to be thrown 1,000 curveballs, and I'm not sure the Fed has the tools to deal with this, even if we all agreed on what needed to be done. Let me put this from the Ukrainian and the Russian point of view.
And agriculture, of course, because Ukraine is a big exporter and fertilizer.
Russia is the #1 exporter of wheat, and it just invaded the #5 exporter of wheat. Ukraine will not plant crops this spring. We have shortages in every kind of fertilizer. Nitrogen, because natural gas prices are up by a factor of 7 before the Russian moves. They're going to go up more. Phosphate, because the Chinese have blocked exports because they're terrified about what's about to happen internally. And 40% of the world's potash comes from Belarus and Russia.
Yep.
No matter how this shakes out, we are going to have famine continental in scope before the end of the year. And this is just the beginning of the unwinding of global agriculture.
When you
this
say
year, I don't know,
scope,
but the carrying capacity of the land in a deglobalized world is about $1 billion, $1.5 billion less than what we have right now. Yes, the whole point of the end of the world is just the beginning, is to look at what all the economic sectors look like on the backside of globalization once it's gone.
Right.
So remove all the structures that have allowed us to build and grow to where we are. What happens when they're just not there anymore? And it's different for every sector. It's different for every region, but agriculture is by far the chapter that gives me the most nightmares. Europe's probably okay. Good farmland, good local fertilizer processing. They're going to have some definite problems, but not famine. Let me give you a point of reference. In 2010, there were a bunch of fires in Siberia because they had a really horrible season for ag. And so the Russians intervened in markets and prevented exports from their part of the world for a few months. Global wheat prices doubled. Global wheat prices tripled in some of the places that used to rely on Ukrainian, Kazakh, and Russian wheat. And that triggered a series of uprisings and coups and wars that we now know as the Arab Spring. And that was from a partial disruption, not a complete disruption. Yeah. And that had nothing to do with fertilizer. Fertilizer just flowed fine. Mm-hmm. What we're dealing here is at least a factor of 6 bigger than that.
Wow.
Yeah, so, and if you look at the countries that have really expanded their agricultural footprint of late, Western Australia, Brazil, they do it all with imported inputs. They're just not there right now. Oil and gas, oil and gas, oil and gas. I mean, I realize that's a little redundant.
Meaning up, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, we're going to lose the world's second largest exporter of oil and largest exporter of natural gas. Mm-hmm. Because no matter how this war goes, either the Russians are going to use it as leverage, or the Ukrainian partisans are going to go after the infrastructure, or the Turks aren't going to let it through the Turkish Straits because they've activated the Montreux Treaty, or the Europeans are going to do sanctions, or the Americans are going to. No matter how this goes down, Russia stops shipping energy west. Yeah. The United States is still a net exporter by a significant margin. We export over 3 million barrels a day of refined product. So while I'm not exactly thrilled with some of the things the Biden administration has done on energy policy, he'd have to do a whole lot more damage to actually impact the bottom line. My concern moving forward is that in a world where the Russians cease to be a player and oil prices skyrocket because it's a globalized market, the US president has the power granted by the 2015 Energy Omnibus Bill to end American energy exports with the stroke of a pen, which means that we'll be fine. Yep. But then the world would lose access to American energy and Russian energy at the same time.
They would
and
break
that's where everything else breaks. That's one of the ways everything else can break down very quickly.
Yeah, it really is.